There was a moment in human history when nearly every road, every sea lane, every trade wind, and every trembling frontier pointed toward a single city. A moment when the fate of continents echoed beneath marble arches and through the thunder of marching legions. Imagine standing at dawn on the Palatine Hill, watching the first light strike the temples, knowing that from the misty forests of Britannia to the burning sands of Arabia, from the Atlantic's edge to the rivers of Mesopotamia, the world as it was known bent to one name: Rome. This was not simply political dominance, it was psychological gravity. The Mediterranean was no longer a sea dividing cultures. It had become Mare Nostrum, our sea, a Roman lake. Merchant ships carried grain from Egypt, silver from Hispania, silk from distant lands beyond Parthia. Roads carved through mountains and forests stitched together provinces that once spoke in different tongues and prayed to different gods. The Roman eagle cast a shadow so vast that even those who had never seen a legionary's red cloak felt its presence in taxes paid, laws enforced, and coins stamped with the emperor's face. The height of this dominion crystallized during the reign of Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century. Under his rule, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. The conquest of Dacia brought unimaginable wealth in gold. Campaigns into Mesopotamia pushed Rome to the edge of the Persian world. For a fleeting, electric span of time, Rome stood at the geographic and symbolic center of the entire known world. No rival power equaled its military reach, its engineering audacity, or its administrative complexity. Yet beneath this grandeur pulsed something darker. Empires at their zenith often conceal fragility. When a civilization grows so large that it encompasses nearly every horizon, what remains beyond it becomes myth, rumor, or threat. Roman citizens believed they had tamed chaos itself. Their laws codified order. Their architecture defied nature. Aqueducts carried water across valleys in silent arcs of stone. Amphitheaters could hold tens of thousands in orchestrated spectacle. Even time seemed Roman, measured by imperial calendars and decrees. But absolute dominance reshapes the human mind. When borders stretch too far, fear shifts from external enemies to internal decay. Senators whispered about corruption. Generals grew ambitious. Provinces simmered with resentment. The very roads that unified the empire could just as easily deliver rebellion to its heart. On that day when Rome ruled the entire known world, it also inherited every fault line within it. What fascinates historians and archaeologists today is not simply how Rome conquered, but how it sustained such control across staggering distances without modern technology. Clay tablets, inscriptions, fort ruins along the Rhine and Euphrates, papyrus fragments from Egypt all tell the same story. Rome was not merely a war machine. It was an organism, alive, adaptive, and quietly terrifying in its efficiency. And yet, as the empire expanded to its ultimate horizon, a question lingered like smoke over the forum. Was this the beginning of eternal dominion, or the first step toward an unraveling too vast to comprehend? To understand the day Rome ruled the entire known world, we have to step inside the machinery that made such dominance possible. Conquest alone does not create an empire of continents. Fear can win a battle, but it cannot maintain order across thousands of miles for generations. Rome mastered something far more sophisticated. It engineered permanence. At the center stood the emperor, a figure wrapped in divinity and authority, yet supported by a vast administrative network that functioned with chilling precision. Governors oversaw provinces stretching from the cliffs of Britannia to the deserts of Syria. Census records were meticulously kept. Taxes were calculated with mathematical rigor. Grain shipments were monitored because a hungry Rome was a dangerous Rome. Even the flow of information was regulated through couriers riding the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system that carried decrees faster than any rival civilization could match. The Roman legions were not just soldiers. They were builders, surveyors, and enforcers of culture. When they marched into new territory, they constructed roads straight as drawn blades, fortresses positioned with geometric clarity, and cities that mirrored Rome itself. Archaeological excavations along the Rhine frontier reveal forts aligned with astonishing uniformity, each one a node in a continental web of control. These were not temporary encampments. They were statements of permanence. Rome was not passing through. Rome was staying. Yet what truly bound the empire together was not iron or stone, but law. Roman law extended citizenship gradually, transforming conquered peoples into stakeholders. A provincial merchant in Gaul could appeal to Roman courts. A soldier from Hispania could rise through ranks and eventually sit in the Senate. By weaving identity into the imperial structure, Rome reduced resistance and absorbed diversity into its framework. This was not assimilation by erasure. It was integration through dominance. Still, the scale of control bordered on the uncanny. At its peak under Trajan, the empire spanned nearly 5 million square kilometers. Modern scholars estimate that up to 70 million people lived under Roman rule. Coordinating such a population without electricity, digital communication, or rapid transportation seems almost impossible by contemporary standards. Yet inscriptions on milestone markers show standardized distances. Coins discovered in distant provinces carry identical imperial imagery. The same architectural ratios appear from North Africa to Anatolia. Rome projected a singular image across immense cultural landscapes. But power that expands relentlessly carries a hidden tension. The further Rome pushed its borders into Mesopotamia, the more supply lines stretched thin. Garrisons required constant reinforcement. Local revolts demanded swift response. The conquest of Dacia enriched the treasury, yet maintaining distant eastern territories proved costly. Beneath the outward image of invincibility, cracks began to whisper. Historians analyzing climate data from ice cores and tree rings suggest that environmental fluctuations may have subtly pressured agricultural output during this period. Grain shortages, even minor ones, could destabilize urban populations. Meanwhile, political rivalries simmered within Rome's elite. The empire looked eternal from the outside. From within, it required relentless maintenance. On that day of ultimate reach, Rome stood like a colossal structure balanced on carefully aligned stones. Magnificent, unmatched, and quietly vulnerable. Stand at the empire's frontier at its greatest extent, and the illusion of invincibility begins to flicker. In Rome itself, marble columns gleamed and fountains whispered in orderly plazas. But far from the capital, at the edge of forests and deserts, the empire felt different. There, beneath cold northern skies or beneath relentless eastern suns, Roman rule stood face to face with the unknown. Along the Rhine and Danube rivers, legionary fortresses watched the shifting movements of Germanic tribes beyond the frontier. Archaeological excavations reveal layers of reconstruction, burned timber beneath rebuilt stone walls, silent testimony to raids and counterattacks. These borderlands were not quiet lines on a map. They were living pressure points. Every watchtower carried the weight of Rome's reputation. Every patrol embodied the message that beyond this river lay chaos, and on this side stood civilization. Further east in Mesopotamia, Rome confronted a rival unlike the fragmented tribes of Europe. The Parthian Empire was organized, wealthy, and fiercely defensive of its territory. Trajan's eastern campaigns briefly pushed Roman power into lands that had never fully bowed to Western control. Cities were taken, standards planted, and proclamations declared triumph. Yet beneath the celebration lingered the question of permanence. Could Rome truly hold territories so far from its Mediterranean heartland? Evidence suggests the answer was uncertain even then. Supply routes stretched across deserts vulnerable to ambush. Communication lagged. Reinforcements took weeks or months to arrive. When Trajan died in 117 CE, his successor Hadrian made a controversial decision. Rather than maintain overextended eastern conquests, he consolidated the empire's borders. The dream of endless expansion gave way to strategic containment. Walls replaced open advances. Fortifications, such as Hadrian's Wall in Britannia, were constructed not to conquer, but to define limits. This moment marked a psychological shift. Rome had touched the horizon and realized that infinity carries cost. The empire that once measured success by expansion began to measure it by stability. And yet, even at this stabilized peak, the sense of dominance remained overwhelming. Trade routes flowed uninterrupted. Roman coins circulated across 3 continents. Amphitheaters hosted spectacles in cities thousands of miles apart, unified by language of law and ritual. But the frontier zones preserved something unsettling. In burial sites along the empire's edges, archaeologists have discovered hybrid artifacts, blending Roman and local cultural elements. This was not merely Rome imposing itself. It was Rome changing. Identities blurred. Soldiers recruited from distant provinces carried their native customs back into the heart of the empire. Religious practices evolved. Eastern mystery cults spread through urban centers. The empire that sought to unify the world found itself absorbing its mysteries. Absolute rule revealed an unexpected paradox. By conquering the known world, Rome exposed itself to forces it could not fully control. Cultural fusion enriched the empire, but it also diluted old certainties. Generals stationed at distant borders gained loyalty from troops far from senatorial oversight. Political power became increasingly tied to military command. The same legions that secured Rome's dominance could elevate or eliminate emperors. On the day Rome ruled the entire known world, it stood triumphant at every frontier. Yet at each border, in every windswept outpost, the seeds of transformation were already taking root. Empires do not collapse in a single moment. They shift subtly and silently, long before marble cracks. In the heart of the empire, far from the restless frontiers, Rome radiated confidence. Walk through the forum at the height of imperial power, and you would see senators in white togas debating beneath statues of gods, merchants negotiating beneath colonnades, and citizens discussing events from provinces they would never personally visit, yet somehow felt connected to. The empire was no longer just territory. It was a worldview. Temples rose in symmetrical perfection. Aqueducts carried water across valleys with mathematical grace. Amphitheaters filled with tens of thousands of spectators, their cheers echoing through stone corridors engineered for flawless acoustics. The Colosseum itself stood as a symbol of mastery over nature and human will, a structure so precise in design that modern engineers still study its proportions. Rome did not merely dominate land, it dominated imagination. Coins struck during this era declared messages of victory and divine favor. Emperors were portrayed not simply as rulers, but as guardians of cosmic order. Inscriptions proclaimed Pax Romana, the Roman peace, as if history itself had reached a final, stable form. For many citizens, especially within the core provinces, it truly felt eternal. Roads were safe, trade was reliable, law was predictable. For generations born into this system, the idea of a world without Roman order seemed unthinkable. Yet illusions of eternity often conceal deep complexity. Maintaining peace across such immense diversity required constant negotiation. Grain shipments from Egypt fed millions in the capital. A disruption in the Nile cycle could ripple through the entire urban ecosystem. Political stability depended on careful succession. When an emperor died without a clear heir, the empire trembled. Civil wars, though temporary, exposed how fragile centralized authority could be. Archaeological studies of urban layers in cities such as Pompeii, Ostia, and Antioch reveal a paradox. Beneath grand architecture lay evidence of inequality. Lavish villas existed beside cramped insulae where the urban poor crowded into unstable housing. Wealth from conquered territories flowed upward. Spectacles distracted the masses. Social tension simmered quietly beneath marble surfaces. There was also a spiritual undercurrent shifting through the empire. Traditional Roman religion coexisted with imported cults from Egypt, Anatolia, and Persia. Mystery religions promised personal salvation in ways state rituals never had. Philosophical schools debated the nature of fate and virtue. The empire had unified the known world geographically, but ideologically it was becoming more complex than ever. And then there was the military burden. Legions stationed across continents required pay, provisions, and loyalty. To secure allegiance, emperors often increased donatives to troops. This strained finances. Debasement of currency began subtly in later decades, reducing silver content in coins. At first, few noticed, but economic pressure has a way of accumulating quietly, like stress within a stone arch. When we look back with modern tools, analyzing pollen samples, climate shifts, and epidemiological patterns, we see signs that Rome's era of absolute dominance coincided with delicate balances in environment and health. Population density in major cities made them vulnerable to disease outbreaks. Trade networks that carried silk and spices could also carry pathogens. The very connectivity that symbolized Roman supremacy introduced invisible threats. On that day when Rome ruled the entire known world, citizens believed they had transcended the chaos of history. Yet history does not end. It transforms. The empire had built structures meant to last forever. But permanence in human civilization is always negotiated, never guaranteed. When Rome reached the height of its territorial power, when its legions stood at rivers that marked the edge of the mapped world, when caravans moved under imperial protection from one horizon to another, there was a quiet, almost imperceptible turning point. Not a dramatic collapse, not a sudden invasion, just a shift in momentum that history would only recognize centuries later. From the vantage point of that era, nothing seemed fragile. Cities flourished, infrastructure functioned. The empire's bureaucracy recorded births, taxes, and military assignments with relentless consistency. Roman law structured daily life from Britain to Arabia. To live within the empire was to inhabit an ordered universe. Yet empires rarely fall because they are weak. They fall because they become too complex to remain unified under the weight of their own success. After Trajan's death and Hadrian's consolidation of borders, expansion gave way to preservation. This was not retreat, it was recalibration. But the psychological difference mattered. Rome was no longer chasing infinity, it was defending magnitude. The energy of outward conquest shifted inward toward management. Over time, that inward focus exposed political volatility. Emperors rose and fell at the hands of their own armies. Loyalty became transactional. The army that once embodied Roman discipline became a decisive political force. Modern historical analysis reveals patterns invisible to contemporaries. Tree ring data suggests environmental fluctuations in the 2nd and 3rd centuries that may have affected agricultural yields. Trade routes expanded contact between distant populations, increasing the risk of pandemics. The Antonine Plague, arriving decades after Rome's territorial peak, would devastate population levels. While this came later, the foundations for such vulnerability were already laid during the empire's era of absolute dominance. Connectivity, prosperity, density. These strengths doubled as liabilities. There is something haunting about this peak moment. Rome did not sense its future fragmentation. Standing beneath triumphal arches, citizens saw permanence. They saw roads that would last forever. They saw stone carved with imperial certainty. Yet history moves in cycles of expansion and contraction. The empire that ruled the entire known world was already evolving into something different. The 3rd century would bring crisis. The 4th would bring transformation. Eventually, the western half would fracture, though the eastern continuation would endure for another 1,000 years. But on that singular day, at its greatest reach, Rome represented the most extensive political unity humanity had yet achieved. It proved that disparate cultures could be woven into a single administrative fabric. It demonstrated the power of infrastructure, law, and identity. It also revealed a timeless lesson. No dominance is final, no structure immune to change. When we stand among the ruins today, tracing inscriptions worn by wind and time, we are not merely observing a fallen empire. We are confronting the echo of a civilization that once believed it had mastered history itself. The stones remain. The aqueducts still stand in fragments. Roads once paved for legions now guide tourists and archaeologists. The world Rome ruled is long transformed, yet its influence persists in language, law, architecture, and governance. The day Rome ruled the entire known world was not the end of history. It was a mirror held up to human ambition. It asks us a question that still lingers in modern superpowers and global systems. How far can power expand before it must redefine itself? And when we believe we have reached the horizon, are we witnessing our greatest triumph or standing unknowingly at the edge of transformation? That is the enduring mystery of Rome.